The massive space station floated in the darkness between stars like a silver city made of metal and light. Inside its huge halls, aliens from across the galaxy moved around talking in hundreds of different languages. The air buzzed with excitement because today was special. Today the humans from Earth would arrive for the first time. Ambassador Taimin stood at the window of his small room looking out at the endless stars. He wore his best diplomatic uniform and carried a briefcase full of documents about Earth. The United Nations had chosen him carefully. They wanted someone calm and smart to represent all of humanity. Taimin had studied philosophy and spoke 6 languages. He seemed perfect for this important job. The aliens had been planning this meeting for months. They studied every piece of information about humans they could find. They looked at human art, music, and literature. They watched human movies and read human books. Everything they saw made them think humans were a civilized and peaceful species who would fit well into galactic society. Council Speaker Veltar was one of the most important aliens on the station. She had beautiful translucent wings that caught the light when she moved. Her people had been part of the Galactic Council for over 1,000 years. She was excited to meet the humans because all the reports said they were very interesting and creative beings. The Vorthon delegation sat in the main conference room waiting. These tall blue-skinned creatures had 4 arms and were known for being very smart. They had read every human book they could find translated into their language. They especially liked human poetry and philosophy. Their leader, Korth Vel, kept talking about how much he wanted to discuss human ideas about art and beauty. The crystalline Zephyrians were also there. These beings looked like living diamonds that could change color based on their emotions. Right now they glowed soft blue, which meant they were curious and happy. They had analyzed human music for weeks. They found it much more complex and emotional than the simple tones most species used. They wanted to learn how humans created such beautiful sounds. Even the plant-like thornlings had come to the meeting. These beings usually avoided other species because most carbon-based life forms made them nervous. But human agriculture fascinated them. The way humans grew food and took care of plants seemed almost magical. They wanted to share knowledge about how to make plants grow better and stronger. When the human ship arrived, it looked different from what the aliens expected. Most species built their spaceships to be beautiful and artistic. The human ship was plain and simple, but it moved with precise control. The docking was perfect without any wasted motion or energy. Taimin walked through the airlock and into a world unlike anything on Earth. The ceiling stretched up so high he could barely see the top. Thousands of different aliens filled the space. Some flew through the air while others crawled along the walls. The noise was incredible as universal translators worked to change every language into sounds he could understand. Veltar met him at the entrance. She was much larger than he expected, but her voice was gentle and welcoming. She told him how honored the council felt to finally meet a representative of humanity. She said they had prepared special quarters for him and his small team. Everything had been designed to make humans feel comfortable. The first meeting went better than anyone hoped. Taimin spoke about Earth's history and culture. He explained how humans had created art and music and literature across thousands of years. He talked about human science and how they had learned to travel between stars. The aliens listened carefully and asked many questions about human philosophy and religion. The aliens were most impressed by human creativity. They could not believe how many different art forms humans had developed. Painting, sculpture, music, dance theater, literature, and dozens of other ways to express ideas and emotions. Most alien species had only 1 or 2 art forms, but humans seemed to create new ones all the time. Taimin also talked about human science. He explained how humans had studied the universe and learned about physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. The aliens were amazed by how quickly humans had developed technology. Most species took thousands of years to go from simple tools to space travel, but humans had done it in just a few centuries. The conversation was going so well that nobody noticed the small problems. When Taimin mentioned that Korea was just one country on Earth, the aliens seemed confused. Most species had unified governments by the time they could travel between stars. The idea that Earth had almost 200 separate nations seemed strange and complicated. When aliens asked about Earth's government, Taimin had to explain that there was no single world government. Instead, Earth had many different countries. that sometimes worked together and sometimes disagreed. He tried to explain concepts like democracy and elections and international law, but the aliens found it all very confusing. The real confusion started when Taimin mentioned military alliances. Most peaceful species had given up armies long ago. They could not understand why Earth would need soldiers and weapons. Taimin tried to explain that humans sometimes had disagreements that led to conflicts, but this only made the aliens more worried. As the day went on, more difficult topics came up. The aliens asked about human territorial disputes and something called the United Nations Security Council. Taimin had to explain about nuclear weapons and military bases and peacekeeping forces. The universal translators struggled with words like deterrent and superpower and proxy war. Several council members began looking at each other with concern. This was not what they expected from a civilized species. The humans seemed to have achieved space travel while still maintaining military forces and territorial conflicts. Most species gave up warfare thousands of years before they could travel between stars. By the end of the first day, the mood had changed. The aliens were still polite and welcoming, but they had many new questions. Several council members requested additional information about human society, especially about the nation that seemed to be mentioned most often in discussions about military power. Taimin noticed the change, but hoped it was just normal diplomatic caution. He had no idea that his innocent mentions of American military bases and NATO alliances had triggered the biggest intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history. The council was about to learn that not all humans were like their polite ambassador. The aliens went to sleep that night with their heads full of questions. What kind of species maintained armies after achieving space travel? What was this America that seemed to have military forces all over Earth? And most importantly, were humans really as peaceful as their ambassador seemed to suggest? Tomorrow would bring new meetings and new revelations that would change everything. The galactic community thought they knew about humanity. Council researcher Kilnara had 6 legs and the patience of a saint. She was famous across the galaxy for her detailed reports that never missed important facts. When the council asked her to study human society, she thought it would be easy work. How complicated could one species be? She was very wrong. Kilnara started with what seemed like safe topics. She decided to study human entertainment and sports first. Most species had simple games that focused on skill and cooperation. She expected humans to be similar. Instead, she found something that shocked her to her core. The first sport she studied was called American football. At first, she thought there was a translation error. The game showed armored humans deliberately crashing into each other with tremendous force. Players weighing over 300 pounds ran at full speed and collided like small vehicles. The goal seemed to be to cause as much physical damage as possible while moving a ball across a field. Kilnara watched hours of footage trying to understand. The humans in the stands cheered loudest when the collisions were most violent. They celebrated when players got knocked unconscious. They called it entertainment. This was not like any sport she had ever seen. Most galactic sports emphasized grace skill and artistic movement. This looked like organized warfare. She tried other human sports hoping to find something more civilized. Boxing showed humans punching each other until one could not continue. Mixed martial arts combined punching, kicking, and wrestling into brutal contests. Even ice hockey involved players fighting with sticks while moving at high speed on frozen water. But American sports were the worst. Americans had taken every possible activity and made it more violent. They crashed cars for entertainment. They jumped out of airplanes for fun. They climbed dangerous mountains just to prove they could. They seemed to enjoy risking death in dozens of different ways. Then Kilnara discovered human military history, and her world changed forever. Most civilized species had given up warfare thousands of years before achieving space travel. Violence was considered a primitive behavior that advanced societies outgrew, but humans had been fighting continuously throughout their entire recorded history. The scale of human warfare was beyond anything she could imagine. The American Civil War alone had killed more beings than most species lost in their entire evolution, from simple animals to space travelers. World War II had involved over 100 million casualties. These numbers were so large that Kilnara had to check her translation software multiple times. But the most terrifying discovery was that humans had not stopped fighting when they developed advanced technology. Instead, they had made their wars more deadly. They created weapons that could kill millions of beings instantly. They built machines that could destroy entire cities. They developed strategies for fighting wars that would last for years or even decades. Americans seemed to be the worst of all human warriors. They had military bases on every continent of their planet. Their military budget was larger than the total economic output of most council member species. They had weapons that could destroy planets and delivery systems that could reach anywhere in their solar system within hours. Kilnara discovered that Americans did not just fight wars, they celebrated them. Their entertainment industry produced hundreds of movies about combat every year. Their literature was full of stories about soldiers and battles and heroic military actions. They had holidays dedicated to honoring warriors and monuments to commemorate famous fights. Even more disturbing, Americans seemed to enjoy studying warfare as an art form. They had universities that specialized in military science. They analyzed famous battles from history to learn better fighting techniques. They studied the psychology of combat to understand how to break enemy morale. They treated war like other species treated music or poetry. The researcher found that American children played with toy weapons from an early age. They learned military history in school alongside mathematics and science. Their popular culture was filled with warrior heroes and combat stories. Violence was not just accepted in American society, it was admired and rewarded. American military technology was far beyond what most species considered possible. They had invisible aircraft that could cross continents without being detected. They had weapons that could strike targets with perfect accuracy from thousands of miles away. They had surveillance systems that could monitor entire planets in real time. But the most shocking discovery was that Americans were still actively preparing for more wars. They constantly developed new weapons and new strategies. They conducted massive training exercises that simulated conflicts with imaginary enemies. They maintained forces capable of fighting multiple major wars simultaneously on different continents. Kilnara realized that Americans had created a society where military excellence was the highest achievement. Their most respected leaders were often former military officers. Their most advanced technology was developed first for military purposes. Their entire economy was designed to support military operations anywhere in their world within days. When she tried to understand American foreign policy, she found more evidence of their predatory nature. Americans maintained alliances with dozens of other nations, but these relationships seemed designed to give Americans strategic advantages. They offered protection in exchange for military bases and economic concessions. They used their military power to influence political decisions across their entire planet. The most frightening thing was that Americans seemed to plan for conflicts that had not even started yet. They studied potential enemies and developed strategies for wars that might never happen. They prepared for every possible scenario, from small regional conflicts to global nuclear warfare. As Kilnara compiled her research, she began to understand that humans were not the peaceful philosophers the Council had expected. They were predators who had learned to use advanced technology while maintaining their aggressive instincts. And Americans represented the most dangerous type of predator the galaxy had ever encountered. They were apex predators who had turned warfare into a science and combat into an art form. They approached every situation as a potential conflict and every relationship as a strategic advantage. They were not just dangerous because of their weapons, but because of how they thought about using them. When Kilnara presented her preliminary findings to the Council, the chamber fell completely silent. The Vorthons turned pale blue, which meant they were terrified. The Zephyrians flickered between red and black, showing extreme alarm. Even the peaceful Thornlings began secreting defensive chemicals. The Council realized they had made a terrible mistake. They had invited predators into their peaceful civilization, thinking they were welcoming fellow philosophers and artists. Instead, they had opened their doors to a species that studied warfare like other beings studied poetry. And somewhere in the darkness of space, American ships were already moving toward the Council station. The warning alarms on the council station began blaring 3 weeks after Taimin arrived. An unscheduled human vessel was approaching at high speed. The ship moved with perfect precision, cutting through space like a knife through water. Unlike the diplomatic vessel that had brought the UN ambassador, this craft looked different, dangerous. Captain Bora Park stood on the bridge of her ship watching the alien station grow larger on the main screen. She had been ordered to escort a special diplomatic mission to the Council. Her ship, the USS Determination, was what Americans called a light escort frigate. The aliens did not know that American light frigates carried more firepower than most species used to defend entire star systems. The ship requested immediate docking clearance. The voice that came over the communication system was polite but firm. There was something in the tone that made the alien traffic controllers nervous. This was not a request that expected to be refused. General Hyun-woo Kim stood in the docking bay preparing to meet the aliens. He was not like Ambassador Tae-min. Where the UN diplomat was scholarly and gentle, Kim was a soldier who had fought in conflicts on 4 different continents. He carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had never lost a battle and did not plan to start now. The American delegation was different from anything the Council had seen before. Instead of philosophers and artists, the Americans had brought tactical analysts, cybersecurity experts, and specialists in psychological operations. They carried equipment the aliens did not recognize and spoke in code words that made no sense to the universal translators. When the airlock opened, the temperature in the council chambers seemed to drop. The Americans walked with military precision. Their eyes constantly moved, scanning for threats and advantages. They smiled politely, but their smiles never reached their eyes. Everything about them suggested controlled violence ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. General Kim introduced his team to the council with perfect diplomatic courtesy. He thanked them for allowing Americans to participate in the historic first contact process. He spoke about friendship and cooperation and mutual understanding. But somehow his words sounded like a commander briefing troops before a battle. The Americans had done their homework. While the UN delegation had prepared cultural presentations and scientific papers, the American team had compiled detailed intelligence reports on every council species. They knew the theoretical maximum speed of Vorthon vessels. They had calculated how many troops would be needed to secure Zephyrian crystal cities. They had analyzed Thornling agricultural systems for potential biological warfare applications. During the first joint meeting, the differences became clear immediately. Ambassador Tae-min talked about cultural exchange programs and student scholarships. General Kim discussed strategic partnerships and mutual defense agreements. The UN team showed artwork and music. The American team presented threat assessments and security recommendations. Council Speaker Veltar tried to steer the conversation toward peaceful topics. She asked about American contributions to human culture and science. General Kim politely explained that American culture was built around the concept of competition. Americans competed in everything from sports to business to academic achievement. Winning was not just important in American society, it was essential. The general talked about American universities but focused on their research into advanced materials and energy systems. He mentioned American art but emphasized movies and books about military heroes and patriotic themes. He discussed American music but highlighted pieces composed to inspire troops and commemorate battles. When Counselor Threndal made a comment about human aggression being a primitive trait that would fade with proper guidance, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. General Kim's smile became colder, and his voice took on an edge that made several aliens step backward. The general explained very politely that American military doctrine was based on preparing for every conceivable threat. He said that underestimating potential opponents was considered a fatal mistake in human strategic thinking. He mentioned that Americans had been studying warfare for over 2 centuries and had developed it into both an art and a science. The Americans began asking questions that made the council uncomfortable. They wanted to know about council military capabilities and defense strategies. They asked about trade routes and resource distribution. They inquired about political tensions between different species and potential sources of future conflicts. When Awine, the aliens explained that the Council had no military forces because they were a peaceful civilization. The Americans exchanged glances that spoke volumes. General Kim nodded thoughtfully and made notes on a device the aliens could not identify. He seemed to be calculating something but would not explain what. Captain Park joined the conversation to discuss space travel and navigation. She casually mentioned that her escort frigate could operate independently for 2 years without resupply. She talked about defensive countermeasures and long-range communication systems. She described capabilities that seemed impossible given the size of her vessel. The Council's technical advisors began asking detailed questions about American space technology. They learned that Americans had militarized their space program from the very beginning. Every satellite, every space station, every exploration mission served dual purposes. The entire American space infrastructure could be converted for military use within hours if necessary. Dr. Sung-Min Lee was introduced as a xenobiologist specializing in alien life forms. The Council members were relieved to finally meet an American scientist rather than another military officer. But their relief faded quickly when Dr. Lee began discussing her research. The doctor had spent months studying Council species biology before the mission, but instead of focusing on interesting evolutionary adaptations or unique biological processes, she had analyzed vulnerabilities. She knew exactly how to disrupt Vorthon nervous systems. She had identified chemical compounds that would be toxic to Zephyrian crystal matrices. She had calculated atmospheric modifications that would kill thornling plant-based life forms within hours. When the horrified aliens asked why a scientist would study such things, Dr. Lee seemed surprised by the question. She explained that American academic institutions routinely collaborated with military research departments. Every scientific discovery was evaluated for potential defense applications. The boundary between civilian and military knowledge simply did not exist in American thinking. The Americans talked about cooperation and friendship, but everything they said had military implications. They offered to share technology that would improve Council defenses. They suggested joint training exercises to enhance security. They proposed research partnerships that would benefit both civilizations. But the Council members began to realize that American cooperation came with strings attached. Every offer of help included American personnel and American oversight. Every joint project would give Americans access to alien technology and strategic information. Every partnership would create dependencies that would be difficult to break. The day wore on, the aliens understood that they were not dealing with diplomats. These were military strategists who approached every interaction as a potential battlefield. They studied weaknesses, looked for advantages, and planned for conflicts that might never happen. The Americans had not come to learn about galactic civilization. They had come to evaluate it as a potential area of operations. The Council's security department made a routine request that changed everything. They wanted to conduct standard scans of the American vessel as required by station safety protocols. Every visiting ship had to be checked for dangerous materials or unstable technology. It was a simple procedure that usually took a few minutes. Captain Bo-Ra Park received the request with a polite smile. She explained that her ship carried standard defensive countermeasures that might interfere with scanning equipment. She suggested the aliens modify their scan frequencies to avoid triggering automatic responses. The security officers thought this was a reasonable request. They were completely wrong. The moment the alien scanners touched the hull of the USS Determination, something impossible happened. The scanning beams simply disappeared. The ship's hull seemed to absorb every type of energy the aliens directed at it. Radar thermal imaging, quantum resonance scans, and even basic optical sensors could not get clear readings on the vessel. Chief Security Officer Varntel had never seen anything like it. His people had scanning technology that could analyze the molecular structure of objects from thousands of kilometers away. Their sensors could detect individual atoms and trace chemical compositions with perfect accuracy. But somehow the American ship was invisible to every scanning method they possessed. Even more disturbing, the American ship was scanning the station in return. The aliens' own sensors detected energy signatures that penetrated deep into their most secure areas. The American scans were so sophisticated that they seemed to be mapping Not just the station's structure but the biological signatures of every being aboard. When Varntel contacted Captain Park to ask about the scanning interference, she seemed genuinely surprised that this was considered unusual. She explained that all American military vessels carried defensive countermeasures as standard equipment. She mentioned that her ship could operate in hostile environments where enemy sensors might be used to target weapon systems. The captain offered to give the aliens a technical briefing about her vessel's capabilities. She seemed to think this would be helpful for future cooperation. The Council's technical advisors accepted eagerly, thinking they might learn something interesting about human technology. They learned far more than they wanted to know. The USS Determination was what Americans called a light escort frigate. It was one of the smallest ships in the American space fleet, but its capabilities exceeded anything the Council had imagined possible. The vessel could operate independently for 2 years without any external support. It carried enough supplies and fuel to cross the entire galaxy if necessary. The ship's weapon systems were described in terms the aliens did not understand. Captain Park talked about particle beam arrays and quantum torpedo launchers, and something called kinetic bombardment systems. She mentioned that the vessel could engage multiple targets simultaneously at ranges measured in light minutes. But the most shocking revelation was the ship's communication equipment. The Determination maintained real-time contact with something called Space Command, which apparently monitored human activities across their entire solar system. The Americans had built a military communications network that could coordinate operations across interstellar distances instantly. The Council's technical advisors began asking detailed questions about American space infrastructure. They learned that humans had militarized space exploration from the very beginning. The first human satellites had been designed for military surveillance. Their space stations served as both research facilities and military bases. Their exploration ships all carried weapons and defensive systems. Dr. Sung-Min Lee joined the technical briefing to discuss her xenobiological research. The Council members hoped to hear about fascinating discoveries and potential medical applications. Instead, they got a lecture that sounded more like a military targeting manual. Dr. Lee had spent the past several months analyzing Council species biology with remarkable thoroughness. She knew the exact atmospheric requirements for each species, and how small changes in oxygen levels or atmospheric pressure could cause immediate health problems. She had identified specific chemical compounds that would be harmless to humans, but deadly to various alien physiologies. The doctor explained that American research methodology required comprehensive analysis of all available data. She had studied Vorthan circulatory systems to understand how their 4 hearts worked together. She had analyzed Zephyrian crystal matrices to determine how they processed energy and information. She had examined thornling root systems to learn how they absorb nutrients and water. When the aliens asked why this research was necessary, Dr. Lee seemed confused by the question. She explained that American scientific institutions always collaborated with defense departments. Every discovery was evaluated for potential applications in protecting human interests. The concept of purely academic research with no practical applications was foreign to American thinking. Colonel Minho Choi was introduced as the mission's technical specialist. He had been quietly observing the station's computer systems and had some suggestions for improvements. The Council's Information Technology Department was excited to learn from such an advanced civilization. Within hours, Colonel Choi had identified dozens of vulnerabilities in the station's security systems. He explained that alien computer networks were surprisingly easy to penetrate because they were designed for cooperation rather than protection. Most species trusted each other completely, which made their systems vulnerable to anyone with hostile intentions. The colonel offered to help upgrade the station's security protocols. His improvements increased system efficiency by 300%, while adding multiple layers of protection against potential cyber attacks. The aliens were impressed by his expertise and grateful for his assistance. They did not realize until much later that Choi's upgrades included monitoring software that allowed Americans to track all Council activities in real time. Every communication, every data transfer, every decision made by Council members was now being recorded and analyzed by American intelligence systems. When confronted about this, Colonel Choi seemed genuinely surprised that anyone would consider this inappropriate. He explained that American security doctrine required maintaining situational awareness in all operational environments. The monitoring systems were simply standard precautions to ensure that no threats developed without American knowledge. The Council began to understand that Americans approached every situation as a potential conflict zone. They secured their operational environment before conducting any activities. They gathered intelligence about everyone they encountered. They prepared for threats that might never materialize but could develop at any moment. American defensive thinking was beyond anything the aliens had imagined. They did not just protect themselves against known dangers, but against theoretical possibilities that existed only in strategic planning scenarios. They prepared for conflicts with species they had never met and threats that had never been observed. The Americans talked constantly about cooperation and mutual benefit, but every action they took strengthened their position while gathering information about potential opponents. They offered help that created dependencies. They shared technology that required American maintenance. They provided security that came with American oversight. By the end of the technical briefings, the Council realized they were dealing with a species that had turned preparedness into an art form. Americans did not just react to challenges, but anticipated them and developed responses before problems could develop. The aliens went to sleep that night, knowing that their station was now under constant surveillance by beings who approached every relationship as a potential battlefield and every cooperation as a strategic advantage. The incident in the station's recreational area started as innocent fun. A group of young aliens from various council species had gathered to play traditional games from their home worlds. When they saw the Americans, they decided to invite them to participate. They thought it would be a nice way to share cultures and build friendships. They had no idea what they were unleashing. The first game was Vorthon Strategy Squares, a complex puzzle that required players to arrange colored blocks according to mathematical patterns. The blue-skinned aliens had been playing this game for thousands of years. Their children learned it before they could walk properly. The current station champion was a young Vorthon named Kelth Mar, who had never lost a single match. Lieutenant Commander Ji-Won Park volunteered to try the game. She studied the rules for exactly 3 minutes, then began playing. The aliens watched, politely expecting her to make beginner mistakes and lose quickly. Instead, she systematically dismantled every strategy Kelth Mar attempted. The Vorthon champion tried techniques that had been passed down through generations of masters. Ji-Won adapted to each new approach within seconds. She seemed to analyze patterns faster than the aliens could create them. Within 20 minutes, she had achieved a perfect victory using methods that no Vorthon had ever seen before. The aliens decided to try a different game. The Zephyrians brought out harmonic crystals, a musical competition that required players to create sound patterns that resonated with crystalline structures. This was not just a game, but an art form that took decades to master. The crystals would only sing for players who truly understood both mathematics and music. Ji-Won listened to one demonstration, then began creating crystal songs that made the Zephyrians flicker with amazement. Her patterns were not just mathematically perfect, but emotionally moving. She combined elements from different musical traditions in ways that created entirely new forms of harmonic beauty. The Thornlings challenged her to growth acceleration, a game where players had to nurture plants through complex life cycles using only natural techniques. This required deep understanding of biology, chemistry, and ecological relationships. The plant-like aliens considered this their greatest intellectual achievement. Ji-Won approached the challenge like she approached everything else, with methodical intensity. She analyzed soil conditions, studied plant genetics, and calculated optimal nutrient combinations. Within hours, she had accelerated plant growth beyond anything the Thornlings had achieved in centuries of practice. Game after game, species after species, the results were always the same. Ji-Won did not just win, she dominated completely. She mastered every challenge faster than seemed possible. She found weaknesses in strategies that alien masters considered flawless. She turned every competition into a demonstration of human adaptive superiority. When the aliens asked how she could be so good at so many different activities, Ji-Won seemed surprised by the question. She explained that American military training included cultural warfare studies and adaptive problem-solving under pressure. Every officer learned to analyze unfamiliar situations and develop winning strategies quickly. She mentioned that Americans approached every activity as a form of competition. Sports, business, academics, politics, even social interactions were all contests to be won. Losing was not just disappointing in American culture, it was considered a personal failure that required immediate analysis and improvement. The aliens began to understand that Americans did not simply play games or engage in friendly competition. They approached every interaction with the same intensity they brought to warfare. They studied opponents, looked for weaknesses, and exploited every advantage they could find. Colonel Min Ho Choi demonstrated this mindset during a casual conversation about computer systems. The aliens had mentioned some minor technical problems with their networks. Choi offered to take a quick look and provide some suggestions for improvement. Within minutes, he had not only identified the problems, but had developed comprehensive solutions that improved system performance beyond anything the aliens had imagined possible. He rewrote critical code segments on the spot, using techniques that were years ahead of alien computer science. But the most disturbing part was how Choi had approached the problem. He did not just fix what was broken, but analyzed the entire system for potential improvements and vulnerabilities. He treated the alien computer network like a puzzle to be solved completely, rather than a simple repair job. When the grateful aliens asked how he had learned so much about their technology, Choi explained that American military training included rapid technical assessment of unfamiliar systems. Every officer learned to understand and improve any technology they encountered. This capability was considered essential for operations in unknown environments. The pattern became clear as more Americans demonstrated their abilities. Captain Park could navigate through the station's complex layout after seeing it only once. She had memorized every corridor, junction, power distribution point, and emergency system within hours of arrival. Dr. Lee could analyze alien biological samples and identify their complete genetic structures using equipment she had never seen before. She adapted alien medical technology to human purposes and improved its efficiency in the process. General Kim listened to discussions about galactic politics and immediately understood the strategic implications of every alliance, trade agreement, and territorial dispute. He could predict potential conflicts and suggest solutions that would benefit American interests while appearing to help everyone involved. The council members began to realize that Americans possessed what could only be called intellectual predatory instincts. They did not just learn new things but mastered them completely. They did not just adapt to new situations but found ways to control them. They approached every challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate superiority. American cultural attitudes became clearer through casual conversations. They talked about competition as a natural and healthy part of life. They discussed winning and losing in terms that made success seem like a moral obligation. They described failure as something that required immediate correction through harder work and better strategies. The Americans mentioned their education system, which seemed designed to create people who could excel at any challenge. American children competed for grade scholarships and university admissions from an early age. They learned that success required not just hard work, but strategic thinking and competitive analysis. American business culture was built around the concept of market dominance. Companies did not just try to make profits but to defeat competitors completely. American corporations studied their opponents, identified weaknesses, and used superior strategies to drive rivals out of business entirely. Even American sports reflected this mindset. They did not just play games for fun, but analyzed opponents, developed game plans, and trained specifically to exploit weaknesses. Professional athletics in America was warfare conducted according to rules, with victory as the only acceptable outcome. The council realized that Americans had created a society that rewarded competitive excellence above all other values. Their most successful individuals were not just talented, but ruthlessly effective at defeating opposition. Their culture celebrated winners and pushed losers to try harder or be replaced by more successful competitors. This explained American military effectiveness. They approached warfare with the same systematic intensity they brought to everything else. They studied enemies' identified vulnerabilities and developed strategies that ensured victory. They did not just fight battles but won them completely. The aliens went to sleep that night understanding that they were sharing their station with apex predators who had learned to disguise their hunting instincts as friendly cooperation. Americans competed in everything, turned every situation to their advantage, and approached peace as simply a temporary condition between conflicts. The final council session took place under very different circumstances than anyone had planned. American ships had quietly positioned themselves throughout the star system. Captain Park explained that these vessels were conducting joint training exercises with their new galactic allies. She seemed to think this was perfectly normal behavior for a first contact situation. The aliens now understood that Americans never operated in unfamiliar territory without securing their environment first. The training exercises were actually military maneuvers designed to give Americans complete control over the space around the council station. Any ship trying to leave or enter the system would now do so under American observation and with American permission. General Kim called the final meeting to order with the same polite smile he had worn throughout the entire diplomatic process. But now the council members could see what that smile really meant. It was the expression of a predator who had already won, but was allowing his prey to maintain their dignity during surrender negotiations. The general presented his comprehensive proposal for galactic security cooperation. His presentation was masterful, combining genuine concern for council safety with strategic positioning that would make Americans the dominant force in known space. Every suggestion seemed reasonable until the aliens realized the long-term implications. Kim explained that the galaxy faced potential threats from unexplored regions where hostile species might be developing dangerous technologies. He showed detailed analysis of how quickly aggressive civilizations could expand across star systems if they were not detected and contained early. His projections were terrifying and probably accurate. The American plan addressed these threats through a coordinated defense network that would monitor all space traffic and respond rapidly to any